Okay, so we are in chapter 17 during cycle 11, and we will be talking about the open sea, so the epipelagic zone out in the open ocean. Here's where we are looking at for this cycle. So remember we said last cycle that we were talking about the coastal ocean. Well, this is our continental margin. Remember this picture? You've seen this 1,000 times as it's coming up on the screen if it ever comes up. Okay, and then here is the water level. This part right here, that is the coastal ocean. Okay, that's what we just talked about this last cycle. That is over the continental shelf, and it has relatively shallow water, and it's close to land, and there's lots and lots of life that occurs here in the coastal ocean. However, this cycle we are talking about this area out here, okay, and this is called the open ocean. Alright. This area is very different, okay? And particularly what we're going to talk about this cycle is this upper layer of the open ocean called the epipelagic zone. And the next two cycles we'll actually talk about the deeper zones of the open ocean. So if you hear me talk about the open ocean, what I probably really mean is the epipelagic zone in the top layers of water. Okay, so regions of the open ocean. Basically what we know about the open ocean comes from plumbing its depths with nets, dredges, scoops, and other gear, and more recently with remote cameras. And our fascination with what's been found makes us wonder what else may be found within the 327 million cubic miles of the salty water that we have here on Earth. And in the past, it was wrongly assumed that life was found only on the top layer of the ocean, in the epipelagic zone. We now know that virtually every gallon of seawater has some living organisms in a reasonable diversity. So there are actually a ton of different creatures that live here in these different regions. So we divide the open ocean into different vertical zones, okay, so that we know where different things are living and what different scientists are talking about when they talk about different zones in the ocean. And we base those vertical zones on the penetration of sunlight and whether it's sufficient enough or not to support photosynthesis. So the top layer of the ocean, where there is enough light for photosynthesis to occur, is called the photic zone. Okay, there's enough light for photosynthesis. Underneath that is the aphotic zone. That is where light rapidly disappears until it's completely dark, and there's like basically a lot of stuff that lives down there, but we will start talking about that next cycle. So the photic zone is relatively or roughly equivalent to the epipelagic zone, which is the top 200 meters of water or so, which is equivalent to 660 feet. So the photic zone, basically the epipelagic zone, which is the top layer of water out in the open ocean, which you can see there on the screen. So most of what we find in the open ocean is plankton. So we have two types of animals that inhabit the open ocean. In the epipelagic zone, you have plankton and you have nekton. Plankton, remember from last semester and from like this entire year, plankton cannot swim against the current. So they're living things that can't swim against the current. Nekton can swim against the current. In the open ocean, we have far more plankton than we do nekton. There's actually very little nekton compared to the plankton. And because there are lots of different types of animals and plants that make up the plankton, in order to accommodate diversity of different creatures, marine scientists use several different schemes to try and organize plankton into logical groups, so that when we're talking about these things with other people, they can have some sort of idea of what we're talking about. So one of the ways that we will actually try and classify plankton is into its taxonomic group. So we have like phytoplankton, which are the primary producers, zooplankton, which are eukaryotic microbes, okay, like little tiny animals basically. And then terms you may have heard before, bacterioplankton, which are bacteria that live in the ocean, and then viroplankton, which are free viruses. And viroplankton are actually the most abundant plankton of all. Of all types of plankton, viruses are the most abundant in the ocean, more than anything else. Two things that you may not have heard before. The first one is cestin. Okay, cestin basically just means particles that are suspended in the sea, living particles suspended in the sea. Tryptin are a special kind of cestin. So they are cestin that has died, basically. They're non-living cestin. So they're non-living particles that are suspended in the sea. That is called cestin. So we can classify plankton based on taxonomic group. We can also classify plankton based on their functional group, so whether or not they move or not. So if you are a plankton and you can move, you are called kinetic. Usually, obviously, if you're a plankton, you won't be able to move against the current, but you may have some sort of flagella or appendages that allow you to move around a little bit. And so you're called kinetic plankton. Akinetic plankton are plankton that do not move at all. They just kind of float there in the water. So we classify plankton based on whether they're kinetic or akinetic. We can also classify plankton based on size. So we had this scheme for classifying plankton based on size back in the day that was based on the collection method that we used. And you had macroplankton, microplankton, and nanoplankton based on that scheme. And macroplankton were basically the plankton that were visible to the naked eye, meaning that they were plankton that exceeded 1 millimeter. So from 1 millimeter all the way up to the big giant like lion's mane jelly, they all were considered to be macroplankton. Microplankton could be caught in a standard plankton net. Okay, and then the nanoplankton were plankton that could be concentrated by centrifugation, meaning if you took a tube with the water in it and you spun it really fast, the plankton would settle out to the bottom, and those were considered to be the nanoplankton. So you can see it's kind of like all over the place, and there's lots of different types of plankton that would be in each of those groups. Nowadays, we use a scheme that takes the full range of plankton and divides it into 7 categories, and each category contains plankton of a size with 1 or 2 orders of magnitude based on the number of 2. Okay, that seems confusing, but basically we took the different like original scheme and divided it even further and made some more clear groups. So we took and put like in the femtoplankton we have like the teeny tiny plankton like viruses. Okay, whereas like macroplankton, it's plankton up to a certain size, and the megaplankton is the really big stuff. So we kind of like separated out and distinguished a little better than we had before. So this just shows you some examples. This would be a nanoplankton. Those would be things like cyanophytes or coccolithophores, etc. And then the macroplankton would be like things like zooplankton and krill. So, other ways we classify plankton based on life history. So we've seen this before, holoplankton and meroplankton. Holoplankton spend their whole lives as plankton, meroplankton only spend part of their lives as plankton, and then will become nekton. So this picture shows you some different types of plankton. This little fish larva would be a meroplankton, because it'd grow up and be able to swim against the current, whereas like these little guys, or like the krill, okay, they will stay plankton throughout their whole lives, so they are holoplankton. Other ways, we will classify plankton based on its spatial distribution. So the neritic zone Okay, the water column that is above the continental shelf, it has its own like composition of plankton, so it's considered to be neritic plankton. Oceanic plankton, okay, will be found in the open ocean, and you'll have less diatoms and invertebrate meroplankton and have more things like salps and larvaceans. And arrowworms and sea butterflies, all of which are things that we will talk about this cycle. You can also classify plankton based on where they are in the water. So you have this stuff called neuston, which are plankton that live their life close to the surface of the water, usually relying on the surface tension of the water in order to stay afloat. And then you also have pleuston, which are neuston that break the surface of the water. So neuston stay close to the surface of the water. Pleuston actually break the surface of the water with either a gas bladder or bubbles. So if you think of like a Portuguese man of war, okay, it's got a big gas bladder that will break the surface of the water, so it is considered to be pleuston. Okay, so those are all the different ways that we can classify plankton to try and make it a little bit less confusing when we're talking to other scientists. But in the open ocean, okay, you actually have patchiness in the open ocean. What does that mean? Basically, that means that the distribution of the plankton that we find is neither uniform nor random. There's patches where there are more plankton than other places. So typically, probably most obviously, we get plankton in patches very concentrated around areas that have upwelling. So maybe around a seamount where the deep water currents that have lots of nutrients are forced upward to the surface, that will create an area of high plankton concentration, whereas you'll have other areas that will not have a lot of plankton. And so we get basically highly localized variations in sea surface conditions and other factors can cause a rapid growth in the phytoplankton numbers in one area and diminished growth in another area. So those things will affect where we find plankton as well. And then we will also have what's called micropatchiness. And micropatchiness occurs throughout the photic zone when marine microbes become attached to particles of organic matter, especially marine snow. So basically what happens is you get this mucus that is produced by certain animals, and microbes, things like bacteria, attach to that mucus and become heavy, and they become what we call marine snow. And so marine snow is basically just strands of mucus secreted by zooplankton that form cobwebby aggregates, and those things literally they fall down to the bottom of the ocean, and as they fall down they are white and they look like snow. So next couple of cycles when we talk about the deep sea, you will see marine snow. It literally looks like it's snowing underwater. It's crazy. And it's basically just mucus with a lot of bacteria on it, which is kind of weird, but it's true. So you get patches in the ocean. Big patches of lots of phytoplankton, and then micro patches of just like this marine snow. And it's actually thought that these micro patches are complete miniature ecosystems all by themselves, which is absolutely ridiculous to think about.